Let's enjoy the beauty of our game with a fantastic endgame study. It's one of my favorites. It's white to play and win. And the reason it's one of my favorites is that there are so many beautiful tactical patterns in this example. And it's so unexpected what I'm going to show you. So I'm inviting you to try to find a solution yourself. That's a big challenge, of course. You may pause the video, think a bit for a while. I'm going to explain you what should be done and how we can get to this solution. So we see that white is having a rook and a knight versus a rook and three pawns. Now, normally speaking, if these three pawns would not be on the board, it's a theoretically drawn endgame. I mean, there are still ways to win. With a rook and a knight, you can give mate. You can even try to win the rook. But if black is defending well, then normally you're not going to win it. Now, with these three extra pawns on the board, the story is a little bit different. Because these pawns, they're actually hindering black in various ways. For instance, the rook is not able to give a check. Let's say the pawn would not have been there. It would just have been a check. And of course, the pawns are taking away squares from the black king. And that may be helpful trying to set up mating nets or even try to win the rook with the help of a knight fork. So that's what we should try to think about in this example. So let's have a look what can happen here. There are so many possibilities. It's difficult to see where we should start. But what we would like to do on the first move, that's very clear. We want to give a discovered check. The question is just how. But for instance, you play here this move, knight f6 check. So the rook hits the king. And of course, that means that the knight cannot be taken. The knight went to f6 to cover the e8 square. Now the question is, where is the king going to? It should go either to c7 or to c8. Now, if the king goes to c7, we see knight fork number one. It's knight e8, and white is picking up the rook on g7 on the next move. That means that king c7 is not a good move, but you can just go to c8. Now there is not a knight fork. We should look a little bit deeper now. Are there any other checks available? Well, the only check here is something like rook c1. So you're attacking the king, and you're hoping the king would go into the corner, because that leads to a type of position we will discuss very soon. But the king goes back to d8, and then you're not making progress at all. Here we see that the king is relatively safe. There's not a knight check. The only thing you can do is rook d1 check, but then you go back and forth, and this leads to a repetition of moves. So therefore, the move knight f6 is not good. It doesn't win the game for white. Then let's have a look at another knight check, or it's a rook check, but the knight moves, of course. So let's say the knight goes to c5. Here you're giving a check one more time. And of course, if the king goes to c7, then again, it's knight e6 with that knight fork we have seen earlier. But after knight c5, a much better continuation here is to go with the king to c8. Now the king is relatively safe on the c file, because if you do play rook c1, it's not a check. You're not attacking the king. So that's not problematic. Now, I had some students who mentioned here this move, knight e6. This looks like a very tricky move, like you're attacking the rook, and if the rook goes away, then the rook can come into d8 with checkmate, as the knight covers the d8 square and it prevents the king from going to c7. However, the only way to save the game here is to go back with the rook to g8. When the rook is safe and the rook prevents white from giving a check on that d8 square. And that means that white is not able to win this position. So also the move knight c5 doesn't win here for white. What is the right move? I hope you found it, but it's to give a check with the knight on f8. This is very interesting. It looks very strange to jump with your knight into your opponent's position, and it's not clear if the knight is able to come back. But let's see what the idea is. Well, we know that the king has only 3 squares to go to. The simplest one to refute is the move king c7, because then again, it's knight e6 with a knight fork, white picks up the rook. The alternative is to run away with the king to the other side, king c8. Now, we just give a check with the rook on c1. That's a very important move. Now, the king cannot go to d7 because the knight is covering that square. So only d8 and b8 are available. If you go with the king back to d8, now the knight is able to give a check on e6. And once again, you're winning that rook on g7. So that means the king has to go into the corner. King b8 is the only move. And now white has this idea. Look, knight d7 check. The king cannot come back to the c file because the rook is accidentally placed cutting off that file. Now the king has to go either to a7 or a8, but it doesn't matter. If you play king a8, then it's rook a1 with checkmate. The king cannot come back, so this is a beautiful checkmate at the side of the board. The same actually happens with the move king a7, because now the rook will come to a1, and in both cases the rook is controlling the squares on the a file. The b pawn is obstructing the king. That's what we have concluded earlier already. Pawn is standing in the way of that king. And the knight covers both the b8 and the b6 square. So white is just winning in this case. So now we go back to the first move. Knight f8 was the move we started with. King c8 loses by force, leads to checkmate in a few moves. How about the king goes to e8? Well, then black is just attacking that knight on f8. The knight doesn't have that many squares to go to, but at least it can go back to e6. And that's a very important move because now you're attacking the rook. And the question is, where is the rook going? Well, there are three available squares, f7, h7 or g8. And we are going to cover them one by one. If you do put the rook on f7, your rook is safe, but your king not. And after the move rook d8, the rook is blocking the path of the king. This is checkmate. The rook is giving check. The knight protects the rook. Beautiful checkmate. So you see that both the pawn on e7 and the rook are just hindering the king. Therefore, rook f7 is not possible. First move can be eliminated from our list. How about the move rook to h7? Well, if you do play this move, rook h7, then we again give a check with the rook on d8. Very important. Now the king has only one square to go to, but here we see that the knight, even though it's under attack, it has a brilliant move. As it comes to g5 with check, you're forking the king and rook. King has to go away. You just take the rook. Black can just recapture, but this endgame is just hopeless. Sometimes you have this endgame of rook versus pawn or rook versus pawns, but here, these pawns are just so weak. They're isolated. They're not far advanced. And with the move rook d7, white is just about to wrap up pawn number 1, then pawn number 2, and the g-pawn is just already blocked by the king. So that's going to be an easy win. That brings us to the only remaining move. The rook has to go to g8. This is very important because now the same idea we have seen before, it doesn't really work. Let's say if you do play rook d8, then the king goes to f7 and the rook is under threat. If you do play knight g5, hoping to give a check, so if the king goes away, you may take your rook, but the king just goes to g7. The king keeps the rook protected, and the only thing you can do is just go back, but then the king can also come back, and you're not making progress. So rook d8 is not good. Let's go back. But the key move here is to play this. Knight c7. You're giving a check, and it's in a way simple, because you're cutting off the king along the d file. The king needs to go this time to the other side. King will go either to f8 or f7. But the funny thing is, it's not going to make any difference. Let's say if you do play king f8, then the rook will come to f1 and the king has to go to g7. Well, if you start with the move king f7, then we also play here the move rook to f1, king g7, and the knight will come to e6 anyway. So we have the exact same position. It's a knight check. The king cannot come back via the f file. The king has to go to h7, or maybe to h6 or to h8, any of these three squares. But wherever you go is just going to be checkmate, thanks to the beautiful cooperation between the rook and the knight. And here again, the pawn on g6 is standing in the way of the black king. So what an amazing sequence of moves. And I've always been thinking how it's possible that these geniuses, they sit down at the board and they shuffle the pieces, and then all of a sudden they have a study. It's just absolutely insane how they manage to compose such such positions. For me, this is very fascinating, and well, I'm at least very glad that Mr. Kubbel invented this position, because it brought a lot of joy to my students in various training sessions I had with them. I hope you also liked this example. Let me know what you think of it. Easy, difficult? Would you like to see more of them? Anyway, what you have to do is subscribe to the channel. Thanks for doing that, and then I'll cover more endgame studies and other stuff on this channel to entertain you. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.